The scripture lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of Nathanael, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. We have a lot to talk about this morning. To begin with, let's just talk about how a sermon or a message like this is written, a kind of how the sausage is made peek behind the curtain. Part of my job each week is to take a look at the lectionary, the calendar of readings that the Christian church uses to walk us through the entire Bible over a period of about 3 years. Now, the weekly lectionary consists of 4 main parts: an Old Testament reading, a psalm, so something worship-related, an instructional letter, sometimes called an epistle, usually something written to the early church by St. Paul, and lastly, a reading from the Gospels. Now, the readings are designed to line up with Christian holidays and festivals so that everything gels with everything else. The real challenge, however, comes when trying to connect this lectionary reading to what's going on in the world today. And that process sometimes feels like an act of translation, not from Greek and Hebrew, but from one context to another. I mean, after all, the scriptures were written in an entirely different cultural context than the one we read them in today, which creates a challenge, at least for me. How can we find the echoes of these holy writings in our own world? How do things remain relevant, or do they? I had coffee with a minister colleague last week, and during the conversation, we both expressed how difficult it can be to keep up to speed on the goings-on in our wider culture. News updates happen so quickly, and there are always so many things to respond to, that it can be really hard to hone in on what matters most. Lately, especially, it seems like we move from one cultural crisis to the next. So I was reflecting to this colleague, and perhaps this thought has already occurred to many of you, how so few of my sermons since beginning here at First Congregational have been generic, meaning fit for any occasion. I believe it's important to comment on current events, but that often dates my sermons. So rarely do we, as a community, get a week free of anything ripped from the headlines. Rarely are our headlines that forgiving anymore. We have to comment. Still, I'm thankful that the lectionary has moved beyond the season of Christmas and Epiphany, and that our gospel readings are taking us back to the life and work of Jesus as an adult. And I'm thankful for that because the circumstances of Jesus' early ministry feel especially relevant this week. All that to say, I hope you'll forgive me if we talk current events yet again. Things lined up too perfectly to resist. The passage this week seems pretty simple on the surface. Jesus is calling disciples to follow him. But one line spoken by Nathanael betrays a startling level of complexity that's happening just outside the frame. Nathanael meets with Philip, who says, "You know that Messiah guy we've been waiting on? Well, guess what? We found the guy. It's this Jesus from Nazareth." So far, so good. It's all pretty standard Bible talk, right? There's a prophecy, Jesus fulfills it, and his followers are trying to convince others to jump on the bandwagon. We've all heard this many, many times before. But Nathanael says something in response to Philip that we should pay attention to. It's actually written on the cover of your bulletin this week. He says, "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And so immediately, a seemingly simple passage with little to offer us becomes much, much richer. See, Philip hails from Bethsaida, and Nathanael comes from Cana. Now, neither city is particularly what we would call upscale, but both have a reasonable amount of commerce, culture, and citizens. Neither are what we would call a backwater, in other words. Bethsaida was adjacent to Capernaum, which had its own fair share of royal families, so Bethsaida had some prestige by association. It kind of rubbed off on them. It also had, that is Bethsaida, had its own impressive fishing industry, so it had its own kind of role, its own importance in its own right. Cana, meanwhile, we don't know as much about, but there's a general consensus today that Cana was probably near Capernaum and probably had some prominent families of its own, if not necessarily royal families. We have the sizable wedding feast in Cana, which is mentioned later in this gospel, where Jesus famously turns water into wine. And later, Jesus is asked to visit the hub of Capernaum on his way to Cana. So all these places, I want you to understand, are kind of connected in reputation, in culture, and geography. Meanwhile, Nazareth. Now, Nazareth is the real backwater here. I mean, some estimates suggest it only had a population of like 500 or so during the time of Christ. Similar to the town I grew up in, actually, numbering about 600 people, with most of the land used for farming or fishing. So, hypothetically, Nazareth had little to offer. And when Nathanael says, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" he's not making a joke. He's expressing the consensus of most people at the time relative to the class, the culture, and the worth of Nazareth. But Philip insists that his friend meet this guy from Nazareth. And when Nathanael encounters Christ for himself, as we heard just a moment ago, he's impressed enough to leave off his other plans, whatever they were, and follow Jesus. Turns out, lots of good can come from Nazareth. Perhaps even the answer to the world's many problems. It's possible that you won't be surprised with where I'm going here. Last week, news outlets reported that the President of the United States made comments about immigrants from other countries. He used a word that I will admit I've used myself from time to time, though usually in reference to a porta potty or an outhouse. Still, there was the requisite level of outcry. Many folks pointed out that our country calls for the poor, tired, and huddled masses of other countries. Others noted that the founding colonists in many of our own states were former criminals, indentured servants, and other so-called undesirables. Some took the president's comments as sign he's a secret racist of some kind. There was a lot of criticism lobbed at the White House. Now, the comments to me were inappropriate. But in all the outcry about the comments, there was one thing that I never heard. And I'm not sure if that's because I wasn't paying attention or if it's because it wasn't being said. Namely, that the president's comments about other countries sounded very similar to the incredibly dismissive stereotypes of working class people that other political folks, sometimes the president's own opponents, have been saying or implying for many, many years. Let me unpack that a little bit. When our current president was elected, many expressed skepticism that it would ever happen. The assumption was that he would lose in a landslide, or at least a pretty solid defeat. But he didn't. And so in the days and the weeks following the president's election, suddenly, for the first time, the news outlets are paying a great deal of attention to his voter base. And what did they find? Well, they found ordinary people across a spectrum. They found wealthy folks and folks in the working classes. They found a much greater number of folks of color than they expected to find. They found a whole group of people who many would never have even known existed had the president not won the election. My point being that an entire voter base had been dismissed by almost everyone with just the wave of a hand until those same people elected our president. And then suddenly, everyone began to pay attention to them. Interestingly enough, it seems we still haven't learned the lesson of that election. We've still not learned to avoid being dismissive of the places and the people that we often hurtfully stereotype. I mean, think back to only a month ago during the Alabama election that had the news media paying attention so closely. I mean, during that time, I heard so many jokes at the expense of working class people, of people from Alabama, of Southerners in general, of ordinary folks like the ones that I knew growing up, like the person I was raised to be. Oh, it's Alabama, people joked. You know what they're like. And so, the stereotyping continued. Yet that election, too, had a surprising result. My point in all this? Nathaniel was really wrong about Nazareth. I mean, he saw it as a place with little to offer. He assumed all the people in Nazareth could be or should be written off. And boy, was he wrong. How often are we wrong about others? How often do we resort to easy labels like leftist or conservative, activist or bigot, white collar or working class, and let those labels do the easy work of writing off the people that we don't want to bother to engage with? The door of prejudice swings both ways. If the president's comments are distasteful, well, so are comments that demean or degrade those who identify as conservative by painting them collectively as uneducated, ignorant, or hateful. When we paint with broad strokes, we miss all the important and the beautiful details about the folks who could turn our worlds upside down in a good way. I had a friend who told me he voted for our current president. Now, some of my favorite conversations about politics in the last 2 years have been with this person. He's an intelligent guy, he's funny, he's compassionate. I would trust him with my hypothetical children. And together, we've had some of the best talks on right and wrong, politics and policy. We don't agree on everything, but that's kind of the best part. Because neither one of us writes off the other person as a moron or evil just because we don't see eye to eye. We're actually able to engage in real dialogue. And I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that if anyone went into that voting booth with their conscience thoroughly explored, it was this guy. Because so much time has passed, it's easy to miss that the scriptures make it clear. The early followers of Jesus were not all on the same page politically. There were zealots and there were moderates. There were those who wanted to abstain from political engagement of any kind. Meanwhile, there were others who thought Jesus would lead an army to set them free. And then there were others who only wanted Jesus to spread peace. The church, even then, even before we called it church, was divided. And thank God for that. Because if we all had to be the same, if we all had to come from the same place, if we all had to have the same labels, if we all had to see things the same way, there would be so little room in the church for anyone. Out of the Nazareths of our world come great leaders. Out of political and social oppression, the world gains the wisdom of a Gandhi or an MLK Jr. whose birthday is tomorrow? What if the greatest gift that we can give to God is also the greatest tribute to the memory of Dr. King, the gift of trying to see beyond labels, beyond place and time and context, beyond left and right, beyond developed nation, and yes, beyond, well, to see the person without the labels. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, we people are often prejudiced. The left is often prejudiced against the right against the left, and U of M and state fans, well, at least we can both agree about Ohio, although don't tell Reverend Petty I said that. We owe it to one another and to our calling as Christians not to underestimate each other. Because guaranteed, if we want to find God, the place we should look is the last place we want to, whether that's Nazareth, Alabama, or Haiti. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Maybe it already has, and it's just waiting on us to see it. Amen.